printing, publishing, and vending of the said work for the term of 14 years. We being willing to give all due encouragement to a work that seems to merit particular regards, as it promises to be of great use in that important point, the education of youth, are graciously pleased to condescend to his request. And we do therefore by these presents grant unto him, the said Robert Dodsley, his executors, administrators, and assigns, our license for the sole printing and publishing of the said work for the term of 14 years, to be computed from the date hereof, strictly forbidding all our subjects within our kingdoms and dominions to reprint or abridge the same, either in the like or any size or manner whatsoever, or to import, buy, vend, utter, or distribute any copies thereof, reprinted beyond the seas during the aforesaid term of 14 years. Now, this statement was confusing to me at first. The Act of Anne of 1708 had already established an author's sole right to copy his work and to protect it from others copying for a period of 14 years. One only needed to record the existence of a book in the Stationer's Register, which an established bookseller like Dodsley would have done automatically. However, abridgment and overseas reprinting was beyond the scope of Anne, and while it's not clear that this proclamation would be legally binding, I'll return to the law in a minute, certainly the word of a king would have served as a deterrent, maybe. And Dodsley seems prescient in establishing these rights, for the work, as mentioned, did find its way to the neighboring kingdoms and across the Atlantic. Nonetheless, it was copied, plagiarized, abridged, reused, and recycled in a variety of ways, presumably most of the time without Dodsley's or his heirs' permission. Certainly, its last edition came out after the American colonies became their own country, a country known in its early years to pirate English texts freely, if we can even call it piracy in a time when no international copyright existed. But even within English boundaries, borders, this statement may have seemed necessary. The years between the early 1740s and the famous Donaldson v. Becket case in the 1770s were ones of uneasiness concerning the scope of the Statute of Anne. Did it restrict or supplement, did it restrict or supplant the common law rights and practices which had often seen books passing down through generations of printers or booksellers? Or did it add an extra security to those? Indeed, Millar v. Kincaid, which directly posed these questions, was in the process of being adjudicated when the preceptor came out. However, I would also like to think about the way this proclamation functions rhetorically to buttress Dodsley's authority as a cultural arbiter. The extra level of protection points to its surplus of significance, if you will, helping it stand out in the aforementioned crowded marketplace of ideas. It also highlights Dodsley's importance as one connected to those of high status, an earl, a monarch, while implying that it is labor in the fields of culture that creates this status. It thus simultaneously promotes Dodsley, his book, the idea that knowledge emerges from and finds its best existence as property, as well as the middle-class ideal that hard work plus taste makes any citizen as good as his aristocratic betters. This proclamation, as Dodsley surely realized, also nicely sets up Dodsley's dedication to the 10-year-old Prince George, not yet the Prince of Wales. His father would die 3 years later, leaving him heir to his grandfather, George II. It is a Whiggish dedication, and implicitly in its presumption that a bookseller might train a king, and he offers the book to Prince George to educate him. And more explicitly, if still subtly, in its pointing out that the prince's, quote, obligation to acquire, his obligation to acquire and cultivate all useful knowledge in order to maintain his high station with dignity and honor. He also stresses that through this education, the prince can command the hearts of a whole people, winning them over as a role model, not demanding their allegiance. Through his learning, then, not through his divine right, Dodsley tells him, the prince can promote the happiness, quote, the happiness of a mighty kingdom, and at the same time establish his own glory in the highest character a mortal can sustain, the character of a patriot king. This former footman, we might notice, is providing the opportunity for moral improvement to the future monarch just a few years after Pamela reformed her errant master. Pamela used her body, her beauty, and most especially her talent for writing emotionally wrenching letters to enact what was, in essence, a rhetorical instead of a sexual seduction of Mr. B into following her virtuous example. What Dodsley has instead is only the authority of print, but that is all he needs. In the rest of the paper, I'll look briefly at the handling of two sections that in a multidisciplinary treatise might seem as precursors to English studies. That is, Part 1 on reading, speaking, and writing letters, and Part 5 on rhetoric and poetry. Let's go back to the table of contents here. Between these two, as you can see from the title page, come geography, geometry, and history. I'd like to think about why these seemingly related subjects are separated, even in a book not meant to be read linearly, chapter to chapter, but dipped into as teacher preference and the scholar's attention, or lack thereof, dictate. After all, rhetoric and speaking have been linked from Aristotle through the early modern period. And how can reading and poetry be separated? Again, the all-important preface provides the rationale. Part 1, the preface tells us, or the preface illustrates, may be seen as a nod to the practical theories of education emerging at this time. The models included in that section are there, the preface explains, to provide examples in, quote, the general business of life. In education and writing, the text asserts, is necessary in that every man has frequent occasion to state a contract, or demand a debt, or make narrative of some minute incidences of common life. With this emphasis on the use of writing in trade and personal business, Dodsley might be giving birth to the field of technical writing, but he is also at the same time sounding the death knell for the act of rhetorical imitation, which had been the basis of student writing instruction for hundreds of years. For these models are provided alongside a stern warning. Let one remark never be omitted. Inculcate to every scholar the danger of copying the voice of another, an attempt which, though it has often been repeated, is always unsuccessful. Copying here is not the unethical practice decried by teachers nowadays faced with plagiarizing students. Instead, copying is literally impossible. The authorial voice possesses a vigor which guarantees the works of lowly imitators will always fail. The idea of the inimitable voice is followed later in the preface by further implications about the practice of imitation and education. In an explanation of Part 5, the preface comments on the purposes of poetry. Quote, rhetoric and poetry supply life with its highest intellectual pleasures, and in the hands of virtue are of great use for the impression of just sentiments and recommendation of illustrious examples. However, it is clear that examples are not meant to be models, for the typical student is not destined for a career as an author. The preface continues, in the practice of these great arts, so much more is the gift of nature than the effect of education, that nothing is attempted here but to teach the mind some general heads of observation to which the beautiful passages of the best writers may commonly be reduced. Art, is clear, is precisely that which supersedes education. Instead of writing, then, the proper student activity when confronted with poetry is looking. And so the preface spells out the method teachers should use in assisting students in developing this skill. In the use of this, it is not proper that the teacher should confine himself to the examples before him, for by that method he will never enable his pupils to make just application of the rules. But, having inculcated the true meaning of each figure, he should require them to exemplify it, not by writing it, which we would have seen in earlier periods. He should exemplify it by their own observations, pointing to them in the poem or in longer works, the book or canto in which an example may be found, and leaving them to discover the particular passage by the light of the rules which they have lately learned. In this bookseller's forging of the disciplines, then, writing becomes segregated from reading, the production of everyday text from the appreciation of a genius bound, we might assume only printed and sold in a shop. Interestingly, these instructions in the preface on how to use Section 5 are in direct contradiction to what the section actually says for itself on how it should be used. Section 5, I'll add